Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 14 of Beers with VCs, where we have casual conversations about the less talked about aspects of venture capital and startup building. We are your hosts, Sabrina Passman and Simon Lancaster, and today we are honored to be joined by Xian Ko of Hustle Fund. Xian has built an incredible career from her early days as an analyst at JP Morgan through Harvard Business School, then turning operator as VP of Corporate Development at NerdWallet, and now co-founding Hustle Fund. Xian, we're so excited to have you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Sabrina and Simon. I'm excited to be here.
You're welcome.
Woo-hoo. So pumped. Okay, first round. What is everyone drinking? Today I have, I've been obsessed recently with Poppies. I don't know if you guys have tried them before, but they're like healthy sodas. This one is a ginger beer version, and I haven't tried it yet, so I'm very excited.
It's the name Poppies. It doesn't have poppy extract in it.
No, it doesn't have poppy extract in it. It's just a prebiotic. It has like apple cider vinegar and
everything is prebiotic or probiotic these days.
Yeah, it's a big phenomenon right now.
Okay.
I have warm water.
Yeah.
An ancient, well-known beverage.
So helpful.
Grandmas believe in. So I highly recommend.
Ooh, yes.
Hard to market, but very available widely.
I love it.
I also have warm water, but it's not just warm water. It is number one, non-alcoholic. I think it's the second episode that I've had non-alcoholic. Brought back from Colombia last year, like legit coca leaf, which is legal to bring to the U.S.
Non-alcoholic, but exciting.
Technically non-alcoholic. And then. Yeah, I don't know. Like since all the Elon rage with the Coke and the Coke Zero and Diet Coke, I've been feeling like it does help with the sleep deprivation. The coca extract, the secret ingredient in Coke. So I don't know, but maybe it's all in my head. It is all in my head.
We've got all pillars of health covered, I think, from our beverage choices.
Oh, look at that. I picked the Bogota mug accidentally, randomly. Very appropriate.
Cheers, everyone. Cheers. Amazing. Well, we're so pumped to get into our podcast today. Hustle Fund is genuinely one of my favorite funds out there. The way that it's so accessible and free-flowing with information into the whole ecosystem, educating not just founders, but also GP peers. Huge fan. Xian, can you tell us a little bit about your journey to start Hustle Fund and what influenced the ethos behind the fund?
It was kind of random, really. So Eric and Elizabeth and I all know each other from college. So we were all undergrads together. Elizabeth and I played on a rec basketball team the whole time we were there. We weren't very good, but we had a lot of fun. And we had been kind of in and around each other's orbits after school. So, Eric and Elizabeth had worked together at 500. They'd started a media company together. Elizabeth tried to hire me. I tried to hire Eric. There's basically just all these connections where we all try to work together, but a lot of these things in life are timing, right? So it's kind of like we like each other, but how do we figure out a way to collaborate? And Eric and Elizabeth actually launched Fund One first, and I was an LP in Fund One. And then when they heard that I was leaving my job, they were like, "Oh, you should come work with us." And I was like, "Yeah, okay, but I'm moving to Singapore, so I don't think that's going to work." And they're like, "Well, why don't you just come hang out with us for a while and see how it feels, to spend time and look at deals together and things like that." They're like, "You've already quit your job, because I was in kind of the process of moving and a shipping container, all the sort of logistics of life." And I was like, "Oh yeah, that's true. Why not?" And so kind of hung out with them for a while for the summer and, rode alongside them as they wrote some checks. And I was like, this is pretty fun. And I had also spent a bunch of time kind of traveling around the region and meeting companies and other funds. And, you had a 2x2 matrix. You're like, start a fund, join a fund, start a company, join a company, right? And you're trying to think through those choices. And I think the way it came down to it was I got a chance not to start from scratch necessarily, but I got to start our international practice investing. So there was sort of a 0 to 1 aspect to it. I got to work with people that I have a high level of trust with, that were very sort of values aligned. And I had fun. Like, so that was kind of, I didn't have some grand master plan. It was sort of like, all right, let's see how it goes. And, to Eric and Elizabeth's credit, they were really willing to experiment, right? Like to go from like hey, this is a US only fund where we sit together in Palo Alto to, hey, we're running a fully remote distributed thing. And we do this international thing too.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's kind of how things started.
I love that. And I mean, there's two parts of that story that I think are really important and I think make such a strong base for Hustle Fund is that the relationships that you guys have all had go back for so long. The level of trust, level of rapport is incredibly high. And I think for starting any company or any fund, it's so important to figure out how to find people that you really enjoy working with and can survive all of the hardships together in a way that that like you like really deeply respect and like know that like we're all working towards the common goal. So I think that excellent advice. I think for anyone trying to start something in the future, like developing relationships is core to making that successful. And then the second thing is very cool to let you totally started the international side of Hustle Fund. I don't think I fully internalized that previously. What was exciting about the region, aside from the fact that you're going to be moving there regardless, but can you describe a little bit about the differences between like US centric and being more international?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the whole like, the internet's going to eat everything, software is going to eat everything trend. I guess now it's AI, but AI is a type of software too. And so that has happened on different timelines, right? So like if you look at developed markets and then you look at China and India and Southeast Asia, sort of like that next sort of big market that has yet to really experience all of that. And yet at the same time, it has, super high mobile penetration, really good demographics. It's a very young region, and young people actually drive a lot of adoption. They're more willing to try new things. And so I think the macro things I thought were really interesting about the region, and all the things that should exist, a lot of them didn't exist, right? So you're like, oh, yeah, of course we should have payment infrastructure. Like, of course we should have rideshare and map, all those sorts of things that you think should happen. And then even all the more specific vertical SaaS things, right? Like, why are all these things still manual? How can you streamlined? So I think like from a macro growth perspective, it's sort of like India is behind China, Southeast Asia is behind India. And so you kind of look at these models and say like, what are things that should exist and don't yet? And can we find people to go found these businesses and build them?
Yeah. We're using a similar like game plan, honestly, for our fund, except instead of geography, we're doing it in different verticals. Like, for example, we're kind of trying to apply fintech strategies for digitization of that industry to manufacturing industrials, because it's an industry that we've seen is kind of underserved from a software standpoint. It's cool that you're basically highlighting the fact that you can do the same thing for geographies as well as verticals. And that seems like it's been a really strong signal so far.
And people can leapfrog stuff, right? Because there are fewer entrenched incumbents. Like obviously, generally, like the incumbent is not necessarily a technical one. Like you're not replacing a software. And so, very few people in Southeast Asia use landlines, right? Like we went straight to mobile. And even on the credit side, right? Like it's not a region outside of Singapore and Malaysia. It's not a region that has high credit card penetration. And so there's all these interesting things that, you want to do with consumer credit and digital wallets and whatnot. So yeah, that's really fun.
Yeah. For, I think when someone is considering starting a company and like trying to find a right fit VC, there's a lot of different ethoses that different funds kind of have around supporting founders and transparency with founders and sort of how to encourage founders. And I think Hustle Fund strikes a really good balance of being both very rock solid in the information that you're able to provide and also very approachable. I'm wondering, like, how do you curate that on a global community? And like, how do you like think about creating that type of environment for your founders and even those outside of your network? Like, outside of your portfolio company?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the three of us have all built and operated businesses, right? And so we try to come at it from the perspective of like, what would we have liked to know at those different points in our career, and that would have been helpful to know. And I think sometimes when you're in the Valley, you take it for granted that there are these like generally known principles about how to operate a business. And if you didn't know them when you showed up in the Valley, you learn them pretty quickly, because you'll go to a dinner party or like talk to someone and they'll be like, oh no, like, I don't think that's how you do it. Or like, at my company, we do XYZ thing. Or like, my friend does this. Do you want to talk to my friend? But like, I think in more nascent ecosystems, you don't have that density of experience. And so it's harder to learn what you think is like generally acceptable or generally regarded as state of the art. So I think when we see, if you find yourself repeating something multiple times, you're like, okay, maybe we should write a piece of content, or maybe we should film a podcast, or maybe we should do something that, people can learn from it. And so that's kind of how we think about productizing that knowledge transfer. But I think there's a lot of things that are like really hard to know until it happens to you. Like someone, you can read about it or someone can tell you about it, but you're like, you don't really internalize it until it happens. So that's like the hard part, right? Which is like, you can tell somebody something and they may or may not listen to you. But you've sort of done your job. You're like, here are my thoughts, and take with it, take from it what you want to. But at least, at the end of the day, the founder controls the business, right? Like, we are minority investors, and the founder works on their business 24/7, right? We think about their business, once every couple of weeks. So, at the end of the day, they have to make the decision. They take the responsibility, but you hope that you can give them a good amount of information with which to go operate, and that you provide some additional perspectives, because you're seeing so many different companies that they don't have necessarily, because they're kind of heads down in their specific.
I think that really highlights the value of creating like an ecosystem truly, of where people can learn not just from their VCs, but also from peers. And I think that is really what sets Hustle Fund apart, is like the community that you've curated peer to peer. Sorry. And I think, Simon, I cut you off.
Yeah, no, exactly. I was going to also mention, I think, you guys have built is a top tier community, really. And you're part of, I know social media is only like a fraction of it, and it's maybe scratching the surface superficially, but like your guys' social media game is on point and really good. And I've been following Eric for years, and always have really appreciated his kind of candor and the value he brings in his everything he posts, for example.
Yeah, just PSA to founders: if you haven't discovered Hustle Fund's public social media presence yet, you should definitely just peruse. Really, really great resources there. We're going to stop trying to inflate your ego, because we're just huge fans. Sorry. We are very excited.
I do have an off-topic question, though.
Yeah,
I would this is off script, but I want to know the story of the purple unicorn hippo.
Oh God, it's so random. Elizabeth really loves hippos, so her Twitter handle is dunkhippo33. And I think it's like from middle school. Like it's a long-standing love of this animal.
Right, it's like the AIM name.
Yeah.
It's also like 8-bit too, which I respect.
Yeah, so basically he loves hippos, and then we like to do these like April Fool's jokes. And so somebody was like, oh, wouldn't it be funny if we like had a hippocorn, right? Because unicorns, hippocorn.
Of course.
And so we like sort of made a joke about it. And then people were like, yeah, you should make that. And then we were like, oh, do we have to deliver this now? And then Eric was like, I bet we can find someone to manufacture it for us. And then he did. And so now they're everywhere and people like it. So he's really he's like, people like it. And then and Elizabeth likes it. And it's sort of, I think it encapsulates like basically we do a lot of things that just entertain us. Like, we think it's funny, and then like, what's the point of having your own fund or your own company if you can't have fun doing it? And so we just kind of run with it. There was no branding agency involved. No one would have allowed us to do this.
It's just a great idea that came to life through a simple, great logo. Yeah, it's
I
very
mean,
cool.
it's
Very
ridiculous.
memorable.
It's people are like, oh, and now there's like all these like stupid like corny puns. Everyone's like, oh, we could have hippo cornhole and big cornhole. guys, we run a fund.
Oh man, there's so many things that start with corn.
I know.
Hippo corn dogs.
I know.
Hippo popcorn.
Yeah. And we put it on our backpacks, right? So we used to have like the backpacks, everyone loves swag, right? So the backpacks used to just say Hustle Fund, and it was useful at conferences because people would be like, oh, like I was meaning to talk to you, you work at Hustle Fund. But now we just have the hippo. And I was with a bunch of South Africans.
Super identifiable. Yeah.
They're like, is that a hippo? I was like, yeah. And they're like, hippos are very dangerous. It's like very cutified, and I was like, well, the hippo corn's not dangerous. It's a fictitious character.
That's great.
Yeah. Anyway.
That's so funny.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. It's a great story.
I love it.
Never look at the hippo corn the same way again.
I love it. I think it just also it makes the vibe of Hustle Fund like super pervasive and like very easy to read from a founder perspective. And I think one thing that I have a question for you, Shian, about for when founders are trying to pick VCs to work with, I think oftentimes the gut reaction is, okay, I need to pick the name that is like the oldest in the valley that will give me the largest amount of check at like the best valuation. And I think at particularly early stage, that may or may not be the best route. Do you have any advice for founders of like what else they should be looking for when considering like which VCs to work with to start their businesses?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would think about it like you're always trying to think of ways to de-risk your business. Having capital is one way of doing that, right? Because it buys you more time to figure out whether the thing is working or not. Mm-hmm. And then I think the type of people you have around the table with you can also help de-risk your business because they know stuff or they have relationships in places where you might not that would help your business. And so I think those people would come in lots of shapes and sizes. I think often people say, oh, my angel who wrote me a $5,000 check is like way more helpful than, random institution that wrote me $1 million check. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a little bit just thinking about like, what are people's incentives? And like what motivates people to help you, right? Like that angel, like they have a small check, they don't have that much money in it, but maybe they really like you. They really think this problem needs to be solved. They're a potential customer, like, whatever it is. And I think that matters to think about what is like, it's not like, oh, if I get funded by brand name firm, I'm definitely going to succeed. It's more like, what else are they bringing to the table? Because at the end of the day, like the founder is the reason something succeeds. It's not the investor, right? As much as investors take up a lot of airtime, like the founders are the ones doing the hard work. And so you as a founder have to be like, okay, well, who is going to have enough time or energy or incentive to help me? And sometimes I think smaller funds have more incentive because you're a bigger part of their fund, right? So it is more material to them that you succeed. Mm-hmm. Versus if you're a really small check and a gigantic fund, then they're kind of like, well, let's see what happens. You could succeed, you could not succeed, but like, you're not going to move the needle on my, gigantic fund. Mm-hmm. And I think personal chemistry also matters. Like you want to work with people that you feel comfortable telling bad news to, because face it, most of startups is bad news, right? It's never up and to the right all the time. And so I think you want to be able to have that relationship, right? Where like your investor is part of your extended marketing team. They're part of your extended recruiting team. They're your sounding board. And if you're not comfortable telling someone bad news, you might want to ask yourself, like, why is that? Mm-hmm. What is it about this that doesn't feel right or doesn't feel comfortable? Because I guarantee you there'll be bad news to share, right? Like there's no sort of avoiding that. And I would reference check your investor. So like I would call founders that have taken money from them before and just say, like, what was your experience like with them? And I think there's a huge range of answers that people can give, right? There's like the do no harm, like they were fine, they didn't hurt the process, but they weren't like huge, or they're helpful because they know a lot about this one specific thing in my industry, and that was the thing that I brought them onto the cap table for. They went above and beyond. Or there's like the other end is like they were like actively detrimental. They sucked up a lot of time. They created negative energy. They were not helpful, right? So I think there's like a range of things, and you can't expect all investors to be the same thing. So I think sort of like thinking through that as you look at your options is how I'd approach it.
Yeah, diligencing VCs is super critical, I'd say. And it's something that I think a lot of founders, when just starting out, feel like they can't do. They feel like there's this weird power dynamic for some reason between like the VC and the founder, when in reality, like you're totally right. The founder is the one that makes the thing successful. It is not the venture investor. You should be very comfortable with telling them bad news. And actually, that's something that we've experienced even in, when we were first starting out. Like founders are afraid to tell investors anything that is negative. They only want to show that they're going up and to the right. Is that something that you like? How do you create that environment for your founders to know that this is totally transparent? We want to know the bad stuff as well as the good stuff, because our purpose here is to make sure that you can make it through the hard times. How do you create that environment? And then also, how do you advise maybe timid founders that don't want to be vulnerable in that way? How do you encourage them past that?
So we try to set expectations up front. So, when you're writing the check is when someone is generally most receptive to listening to you. And we sort of say like, hey, like, here's our expectation on how often you're going to send us an update. And then we have a template and we're like, hey, here's a template of what a good update looks like. And, I kind of try to walk through like, you think about your business 24/7. Your investor doesn't. So when you send an update, it has to be at the right level, right? So it shouldn't be 10 pages of excessive detail, and it shouldn't be like one paragraph with no numbers, right? Like you need to sort of pitch it at the right level. And so it's sort of like, hey, this is our business. Here are the drivers. Here are my priorities for the next 6 months. And here are the initiatives that like roll up to these drivers, right? What I'm trying to learn or prove or whatever it is. And here's how it's going. And provide numbers. And provide a time series numbers. Don't provide numbers in isolation, right? Because we want to know, like, is it going well or is it going badly? And then ask for help. Put in, like, there's a section that's like, I need help with XYZ thing. I think a lot of people don't ask for help, or they ask for like very general help. And, you should ask for specific things. And I think that sort of sets a contract with people to interact with you in a constructive way, because you sort of told them your priorities, you told them how those initiatives were working, and then you asked for specific items of help, right? I think sometimes founders are like, they don't know how to write the update. So then they get a bunch of questions because everyone's like, you said this, like, what does this mean? And then they feel like, oh, like, why am I getting all these questions? Like, and then they're like, they don't want to send updates. And you're like, no. Like, it is on you to like set the tone of how to communicate, but you need to think about what your audience knows relative to what you know, and how do you communicate and use them in a constructive way. But also, that is your responsibility. When you take other people's money, you have to communicate to them. And you need, and we say our expectation is that most things will go sideways. So don't worry about that. We're not going to freak out, but you need to communicate. You can't be silent for 6 months and then be like, I have 30 days of runway left and I'm not going to make it next month. I need to raise a bridge. Like, you're like, that is not setting up a good trust-filled relationship, right? So it's like, so I think like you would be shocked, right? You can say this upfront to 100 people and maybe 50 people will listen to you. So I think there's the sort of like, you want to set the expectation and then you have to build a personal relationship, right? And you have to make them comfortable. But it's not 100% hit rate for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I love the idea of providing a template and kind of using that as a method to coach good communication style. when in practice, I think a lot of founders that are just starting out, either because they're just fresh out of college or because they worked in large organizations where communication wasn't prioritized, like how to do that properly and well can change not just your persona as a CEO, but like how effective you are as a CEO. And that communication style doesn't just apply to yourself to investors. It applies to every single person that you communicate with, is understand like to what level things must be communicated, to what tone. You're trying to figure out how to understand what information you want to get from the person and what help you need from that person that you're communicating to. I think that's one of the most like under emphasized skills that are required of being a solid CEO. It's not just, are you smart with a good idea? It's like, how do you actually communicate all of these other facets of this multidimensional thing that you're trying to build to all of the people that possibly can help you achieve that? Really, I love the idea of doing a template. I think we'll start one as well. It's a fantastic idea.
And I'm happy to share my template with you. It's
wow.
Like a made up, it's a made up company, right? So it's fine. I mean, I wish all founders sent good updates, and they would be so happy.
Yeah.
Xian, I'm curious, how many founders do you think send this template update just to Hustle Fund versus to all of their investors? And like, has there been a trending direction for that?
Oh gosh, I have no idea. I mean, I would assume like there's no point writing different updates, right? Like I would assume you just like write one and send it.
Unless you're afraid of your other investors. Yeah.
Yeah. You read my mind.
Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite founders, he sends it and it's a Notion doc, and then you can see all the investors comment on it.
Oh, that's awesome.
That's really cool.
He makes it multiplayer and he answers questions, and then he'll like link out to his dashboard, like, you know, when he wants to like double click and be like, oh yeah, like, you know, you asked this, is this, like, here's what's going on.
It's ballsy. I like it.
That's so fantastic though. I mean, like, honestly, like the hive mind of multiple investors can be much better than anyone individually. And once they've all invested, they're all bought in anyways. And so there shouldn't be any like walls between the communication that's shared. I really like that idea. I would be down.
I think it depends on your investor like group, right? I think once again, this goes back to like curating your investor group, which is just like, in a sense, as a founder, you have to train your investors on how you see your business, right? Because otherwise they will be like, what about this thing? What about that thing? And you're like, no, we're not focused on that thing, right? And so I think there's an aspect of training them to be like, remember, these are the drivers we're focused on. Or like, remember, this quarter is about understanding this aspect of the business. And so as a founder, I think that is your responsibility. Like you need to set the tone for how you interact with your investors. But then also like early on, like I think people often have a really grab bag of investors, right? You could have like angels, family, like, and different people have different informational needs. And depending on the size of the check too, you may be more or less willing to cater to those informational requests. So that's just something like as the companies progress and go along. But I think in general, like more communication is better than less. I think there are some people who are very insensitive, like competitive things. They don't want their competitors to know. And then there are sometimes there's sometimes bad investor behavior where they like share the information that they shouldn't. So that is like maybe one caveat to all of this.
Yeah. And that comes down to the like vetting from previous founders that have worked with those investors. Like, what has it been like? And, you know, are they very free flowing with help, or are they toxic in XYZ ways? And how do you protect against those, et cetera? So yeah, excellent advice, I think. So suppose I'm a founder. I like understand the vibe of the company that I want to create. I understand the type of investor relationship that I'm hoping to have. And I identify my dream set of investors. Do you have advice on how to make yourself stand out as a founder to those investors in a way that's, will help guarantee that investment? Like what, aside from obviously preparing your deck, like doing your research on the venture capital team themselves and the individuals that you'd be working with themselves, what else can a founder do to really like solidify their dream investor team?
Oh gosh, there are no guarantees. Fill the top of funnel. That's always what I say. Well, I mean, I think if you think about it, right, like you don't know what's going on inside those funds, Like, you know what they put out publicly, but you don't know. Like, that's why it's always like, well, who's the decision maker? Like, what deals did they do before? What biases did they have? Like, every investor, every human, every group of investors, they have their own biases. They're like, oh, well, 2 funds ago, we invested in this category and it sucks. We got burned, blah, blah, blah. I mean, and I think we want to think that we can learn and we're not biased, but like we are, right? And so you can't control that as a founder. So when you think about the things that you can control, right? What can you control? You can control how many people you talk to. You can control how well your business is doing, sort of, right? Like, and that's kind of it. So there is some, like, there are better pitches, there are worse pitches, but there's not, I feel like there's no guaranteed way other than like, oh, your revenue chart looks like that. So everyone's like, I got to take a meeting. Or you're like a repeat founder that made billions of dollars for people, then you have no problem, right? But for most people, that's not the case, right? So for most people, then it is, how do you articulate what you're doing in a way that is like pretty easy for folks to understand right out of the gate? So that like, they're like, I want to take a meeting.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of people spend a lot of time explaining in excruciating detail, but without the sort of bigger picture of like, if I'm successful, why does this matter? So then you're forcing the person to like go through whatever detailed thing you've done to be like, I think it matters because da 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 da. And then they're guessing, right? So like there's a lot of like loss there, like yield loss, I guess. So like I think instead think about like, I mean, someone pitched me this morning and like it was pretty interesting, but it took them sort of like 15 minutes to kind of like get through everything. And then I sort of played it back and I was like, okay, so what you're telling me is you are addressing this vertical that is adjacent to one that everyone knows and is very lucrative, where all the startups have attacked, but your vertical, because it's like kind of weird and smaller, no one has attacked, but it's still big. Mm-hmm. And you're bringing sort of like modern techniques to it. And oh, by the way, you already have 20 customers paying you $400,000. So I just did that in 15 seconds.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Quite a while to get to that point.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's sort of like, so when you hear that, you're like, oh, I'll take a meeting, right? Like you're kind of like, yeah, because I know the big market that you mentioned. So it's not hard for me to extrapolate that thing. So then I just have fewer things to validate in my head, right? And so I do this thing where it's just like, everyone thinks their baby is cute, right? But VCs see like 100 babies a day. So like, how do you, and nobody likes being told their baby is ugly, correct? But it's not, it's a relative thing. Is your baby cuter than the other 99 things that I saw, right? And should I spend more time on it? And so how do you get someone to spend time? You need to get to the point quickly, and you need to get to the point where you're just like, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Or that's a different way to approach that problem. Or you're like, how come no one's done that? You know, and then you can kind of see that going, but like a lot of pitches sound the same. And then you don't know whether you should do the work to figure out like what makes it different. And so I think as a founder, the biggest service you can do for yourself is to help people do that thinking, because presumably you've done a lot of that thinking. Otherwise you wouldn't be spending time on it. Right. So I think that's the thing, is to like help them make that connection. A related problem that people have is, and I think this is a hard thing, which is in the early stages, you have to be fairly tactical because you're trying to make progress. Mm-hmm. So, but it's all off of a small base, right? So everything kind of seems like you're like, okay, yeah. But you need to help people see how that, like, all those like small tactical steps actually ladder up into that bigger picture. So it's back to the like, first there needs to be like a big, so what? Like if we're successful, it could be this. But then you need to help people see like, here's how all the things that I've done along the way actually ladder up to that, and help people connect the dots on it. So I think that's like this case, like she didn't even tell me until the end that she'd signed like a major distribution deal.
Yeah. And
right?
I've noticed this too. Yeah, because like founders like to go chronologically a lot of the time. Of, like, these are my struggles. This is how I built what I like. This is what I thought.
Yeah.
This is how I built it. And then at the end, they're like clencher, like now I've had the success. When in reality, like to your point, like in a half-hour meeting, you got to move that up front. Be like, this is why we're going to be successful. We already have this traction. The reason why we're having traction is because we're doing this industry in a slightly different way that is going to be successful because the other industry was successful. And I think like
Yep.
the way that I love the way that you pitched it, Chan, because like that is exactly like you touch on all the points that from a VC lens, it makes complete sense. But I can see from a founder lens, like it doesn't quite capture the like pain and suffering that they went through to get there. And I think founders love to like walk through people like, look how much I've suffered to get here. When in reality, like if you only have a half-hour meeting, you can't do that fully. And that can come out absolutely in later meetings, and the respect and rapport is there. But when you only have like half an hour to catch someone's attention, like that's not how you get it oftentimes. Like, would you agree with that?
Yeah. And it shows up in the blurb too. You know, when like someone's like, oh, my friend's starting something, and you're like, great, can you like send me the blurb of like what they're doing?
Yeah.
And then like 8 paragraphs, and you're like, what is that?
What is the point of this? Yeah.
Well, no, but that's why it's like I always be like, what's your money slide? Do you have a money slide? It's like, yes, I have to take the meeting. It's the same thing, like you have some money stat or like bullet, right? Where you're like, oh, okay. And I think that's the thing is like, especially if you're in something a bit more esoteric, and you're talking to someone who's not a specialist, then you just need to make it like just make an analog that works for them. Even though I know people hate the like it's Facebook but for dogs or whatever, right? But you know, analogies have a purpose, as long as it's not too ridiculous. When you're like, yeah, right, no, you're not that. But as a tool to accelerate understanding, I think it's useful.
Yeah.
So good blurb. We actually have an article, one of our most popular articles, Venture Capital 101, How to Write a Good Blurb, on LinkedIn. And then the other 2 points are also very valid, which is don't bury the money shot. Like, where's your money slide? And then like the chronological nature of storytelling, which we're all inherently ingrained to do, is not the best. Is usually almost always not the best way to storytell. It's
do it later,
chronological, but later. Okay,
later.
Yeah, not
right.
on the
Get the meeting. Get like, and I think another way to think about it is, what are the 3 things I want this person to leave the meeting with? You know, is it that, you know, your ex-husband did the random thing that led to the it just sort of like you're like, no, that's not really the relevant point, right? The 3 things you want to leave the meeting with are like, huge unaddressed market. They still use the fax machine, and we got all these people to stop using the fax machine, and they pay us money to do that, right? Like, but I kind of love these businesses too, right? Because it's like they just went out and like made a business and people paid them money, and you're like, yeah, that's it. We start a business to make money. We don't start a business to raise money. Raising money is a little part of the story, right? So I think there's that aspect of it. I think with the one exception is probably like really deep tech sciencey things. They actually require like a decent amount of preamble. Often in those scenarios, you are actually pitching specialist VCs. So they'll already have a lot of the science.
Totally. Yeah, we see that too. And I think, I mean, even to that end, though, even with specialist VCs, there still needs to be the connection of like, okay, this very specific niche technology that is different from all these other things is going to help the world in XYZ ways and make this much impact / money / something. So like it still needs to tie in even in those technical conversations. But I totally agree. Like going deeper to explain tech in certain scenarios does make sense. I think the other thing I wanted to touch on that you just mentioned was the whole competitive aspect of the pitching and the fact that founders really like on a weekly basis need to outperform the other ones that present to the VC in that week. And given that it is incredibly cutthroat, like you don't know who you're competing against really, so you can't really prepare how to be better than them in a lot of instances. And I know we were mentioning in a like previous chat how to create a community despite the cutthroat nature of like being a founder, like how do you create, how, if you can't benchmark yourself against these unknown founders that you're competing against, are there ways that you can create a community of founders that you can learn from that are maybe a step or two ahead of you? And like, how do you create a founder community for yourself? Do you have any advice for that? Like outside of the VC that, you know, has portfolio companies, like, are there other ways that founders can go about that?
I mean, I think you have to just make friends, right? But I think that's why people end up in places like San Francisco or like hubs, because there's just more people who are like you, who are building stuff and who you can trade notes with. And so I think it can be isolating if you're in a place where like you're one of very few founders, right? And everyone's like, who's that weirdo sitting in their basement coding? Versus where, you know, every day there's a happy hour to like, you know, try out new models or see demos and things like that. So I do think you kind of need like probably like 3 or 4 people that you can be transparent with. And I think on the benchmarking thing, it's an interesting one. I was talking with someone who runs like a sort of accelerator / residency program. And, you know, they were saying like one of the biggest things is like they do a weekly demo day with just the people in the program. And it really spurs everyone else on because they see how much progress the other teams have made. And they're like, oh man, I need to step up my game. Or, oh, that's a really interesting approach they took. Can I apply that approach to my problem that I'm working on? And so I think having like a group is not just like therapy necessarily, right? But it's also seeing like other ways of solving problems. Even though you're not in the same field, there are approaches that can be applied to multiple domains. And seeing how people solve that is interesting. Yeah. And so I do think like there's always all these like pitch days where people have to pitch investors, but I actually think we should have more like demo, like work in progress days, right? Because I feel pitches have this illusion of like, oh, it's like this finished, perfect, shiny thing. And you're like, give me money. But that's like, it's always a continual process. And I think if people could like demo more, they would actually get more feedback, first of all, which I think would be helpful for the founder. But also even as an investor, like being able to watch someone's trajectory over like multiple points in time, I think is actually really useful information. And so I think,
and probably the most consistent way to fundraise. Maybe not what all the outliers do, but it's kind of one of the, I think, best ways to have a recipe to fundraise.
Yeah, I mean, it's over time. Yeah, it's the version of like, I'll add you to my newsletter, and then you see this person like executing steadily month over month. And you're like, oh, okay. You know, it was sort of half baked when I met them, but you know, now 6 months later, it looks pretty interesting. Let me reach back out. So, yeah, I think that's like that's the hard thing, right? Which is like, don't isolate yourself. Don't sit in your basement, but really try to find other people to show your stuff to, and then like make steady progress. And like, there's a version of it, right? It's like the build in public people, but then I think that's a much wider aperture, and you might get some random stuff. But I think if it's specific enough, then you'll get people who actually really care and interested in your problem.
Yeah, I really liked your point about the fact there's few things less, or there are a few things more motivating than seeing other people sprint faster than you that are like either in your vertical or not, but just seeing like, oh shoot, we were in a similar stage and now they're like leapfrogging me for some reason, and getting to like just tap in and see, okay, what have they been doing that I haven't? It really makes you run faster. And I agree with your point. Like a lot of people say like, why is Silicon Valley still the place where so many startups like come and thrive? It's like that information sharing piece. And I think, yeah, figuring out how to have the information sharing outside of the Silicon Valley geography or tapping into it somehow virtually is incredibly useful. Yeah. There were 2 other things that I wanted to chat through. One of my favorite things was you have a common phrase that you tell your startups around some of the biggest potholes that they need to look out for. And it's around needing to focus and not taking on more than you can, biting off more than you can chew necessarily. Can you walk us through like that phrase that you often say?
Oh gosh. You heard it here. So I say to people, more startups die of indigestion than starvation.
Yeah.
And that might not feel true to you if you're like struggling to raise money, but I actually find that like people try to do too many things at the same time. And whether that's before raising or after raising, I find it pretty consistent. In Southeast Asia, it has a specific manifestation in which people try to like launch in multiple markets at the same time. And I'm like, no, please don't do that. Can you just get one market working first? Like, don't launch in 5 markets at the same time.
Right.
So that's like the challenge. Or like sometimes people think, I'm building a compound startup. Like, look, Parker Conrad wrote this blog post about compound startups. I was like, are you Parker Conrad? Do you have $1 billion exit? No? Okay. So like, what's the probability, right? Like that's not, and I'm not saying don't be ambitious. Maybe that is your vision, but like, it's very hard. Like startups have very few resources and your only asset here is speed. So it's really hard to do multiple things very quickly. And, I really just encourage people to like focus, right? And that's focus on multiple dimensions, which is like, you need to go find the right customer set. Because in the beginning, you're just like, oh, well, like, I'm still trying to find my ideal customer, right? And then you're like, okay, then this is the value prop. We're going to go after this person. We're in one channel, right? So it's like, don't launch 5 countries. Don't launch 5 channels. 1 country, 1 customer, 1 channel. Make it work. Then do the next thing. And so that's like that's I think the thing that I try to tell people, and it's really hard. I was like, what are your priorities for the quarter? They're like, here are my 10 priorities. You're like, you can't have 10 priorities. Maybe you can have 3, but preferably 1 or 2. And so I think that's like that's the hard one. And really thinking about what's going to move the needle for you, because in a startup, everything kind of feels broken. Everything is suboptimal, right? There's like 100 things. They're just like, this is so janky. But it's not existential. Most of the jankiness is not existential. There's very few things that are truly existential about your business. And so you should only focus on those things. And it's really, really hard. So the story I always tell people is like, when I was at NerdWallet, the early years, the whole thing was built on WordPress and it looked terrible. And every time we had a new employee, they'd be like, we should redesign the website. And then the founder would be like, why? And they're like, well, it's a financial thing. So like we'd build trust with the user and then it would improve conversion. And the founder would be like, well, right now, 10 people come to our website. So even if you improve conversion by 100%, that would be like 1 more credit card that we had successfully referred. So he's like, so we're not going to do that. Like, right. And like, it takes an incredible amount of fortitude to do that, because every day you look at your website and you're like, God, it looks pretty ugly. And you want to, you're like, I can't, but you're like, is this the material thing? There's a spectrum of these things, right? Like you shouldn't have misspellings, the button should work, all that sort of thing. But I think there's many versions of this thing where it's like, you could spend time on it, but is it existential, right? For us, like that's not existential. Like you can work on conversion after you actually get people to like come to your website. So
top of funnel again.
Top of funnel. Yeah, a few things you can control. Top of funnel is one of them. But yeah, it's a hard thing. And I think people who really struggle with it, people who come from professional services, they're used to everything looking really good, being really like pixel perfect. I had a guy I hired out of Goldman Sachs, really smart guy, and he was doing BD, and it took him like 2 hours to write an email. And I was like, what's going on? And he's like, well, I'm just checking it. I want everything to be right. And I was like, dude, I need you to send like hundreds of emails. Like I can't, he's like, well, I want it to be right. And I was like, yeah, but they don't know who we are. It doesn't matter almost, right? Like you're not going to like send something crazy. Like it'd be better that you sent 100 emails and like 5 of them were wrong, but we got like 95 emails out, then it took you 2 hours to write one email, right? So I think there's this element of like, can you 80-20 things, and can you
Mhm.
this?
Yeah.
Embrace
As-
the jank.
To an
Embrace it.
extent. I myself, yeah, I'm definitely a recovering like perfectionist type. It would take me, especially early on in my career, like again, like hours to send an email because I was like, I need to make sure I get every single little detail of everything that I worked on completely summarized concisely. And the output that I had early on in my career was just so much less. And honestly, like the 80-20 rule is so critical. Like you really like there's such a diminishing amount of returns for actually moving the project meaningfully forward if you get to perfection on every single step of your process. It's just really not sustainable, particularly in a startup landscape. And I think I'm not sure about the founder personas that you typically interact with for Hustle Fund, but for us as mostly engineers that are recovering from like corporate life that are trying to enter the startup land, that's one of the hardest things to like break people out of their shell and say, it is 80% good. This is going to get us further than if you wait another like 2 weeks to get every single detail accurate and completely perfect. Yeah, I very much resonate with that one personally. And I think the other really jarring thing that is so true that you mentioned before was sometimes you have to fire your customers. And can you elaborate on that concept? Because when I heard it, like my visceral reaction was to getting customers feel so hard. And
Yeah.
what's a scenario when you should fire
Well,
one?
Well, when you're first starting, you're like, I just need customers, right? Because if I have had someone willing to pay me, I'm validating that like what I'm doing is useful, right? They gave me cash money, and my thing is in the world. Someone's using it. But to get to scale, you need to find repeatable processes. And like part of that repeatable process is customer acquisition, right? And so there will be certain customers that you acquired in your like founder-led sales portion of your business that are not actually profitable customers for you. But you don't realize that at the beginning, because in the beginning you just have this like spread, right? You have a theory, you go out, and then you're like, oh, well, maybe it's this SMB customer, or like, oh, maybe it's this mid-market. You're like, oh, it's definitely not enterprise. Like those, I'm not SOC 2 compliant. I haven't done all those things. But so you're kind of like wandering around trying to find the right customer. And it's sort of like an interpolation game, right? So you get closer and closer to the answer. But as you're getting closer and closer to the answer, you have all those people at the edges that you started out with who are actually, don't spend that much with you, have a lot of customer support requirements. They actually wound up like not being great customers. And so it's back to that focus point, which is like, at some point you have to be like, that person's not my customer. That is not the customer persona. And you kind of like move them away. And you're like, hey, I actually don't think this product and where it's going is going to be a great fit for you. Like, we'll continue supporting you at this level, but we're not going to do more than that. And that, I think that's hard, right? Because you want to honor people who took an early chance on you. There's all this like emotional stuff involved, but there are people who are not good customers for you. And so I also ask people this question when they're pitching. I was like, who are your best customers? Like, who, if you could have 100 more of this person, like, would you want? And who are your worst customers? Okay, what are you doing with those bad customers? Like, why are they bad? And so, like, some people haven't even thought about that in that framing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there is this element of like, how do you continually say like, these are a good fit, these are not a good, even in venture, this is true, right? There are some businesses that are a great fit for your fund. And there are some that are just not. Like, they are going to be great investments for someone else, but they're not going to be great investments for you. And there's like very specific reasons for that. And it's not good or bad, it just is. But because you can't be everything to everyone.
Mm-hmm. Completely agree with that. Protecting your time and energy as a founder too, not just from and also I guess the team's time and energy too, like trying to serve customers that are just diminishing returns and like going down paths that have not the adequate amount of ROI to really move the company forward. Like that is the hardest part of being a CEO and a founder, is figuring out like which paths, emotionally, resource-wise, physically, sometimes when you're traveling, like which ones are actually the highest ROI opportunities. And again, like the inclination is, as a startup founder, you want to say that you can take over the world, like you can do it all. And you need to be very careful about how you choose to do it all and who in your path is really going to help you get there. Amazing learnings.
One exception. I think focus is really important. I would give a small budget to serendipity. So I think the flip side of like extreme focus is like you're just like heads down in your crevice, some very narrow channel, and you're like working your ass off, right? But like sometimes you need to have a little bit of budget, time, mental bandwidth, whatever it is, for serendipity. And that is like, hey, meet other founders, meet other investors, even if you're not raising, like go to a talk or something, like have new thoughts hit your brain. Because I think that also helps you think about your business in different ways, or can help you make connections that would help you in ways that you hadn't thought about because you were kind of like heads down in something. And so then it's like the balance, right? Like obviously I think the caricature of this is like, oh, there's the startup founder who only goes to conferences and doesn't do any work. Not that, but I think select small amounts of serendipity should be budgeted for, because you just don't know. So
yeah, we actually live this ethos very deeply within our own fund. I think like Simon and I have personality types that are very complementary, but very different. Simon's super divergent thinking, always thinking about new connections, things that I never in my wildest dreams would have ever connected. And then I'm much more convergent and figuring out how to get things to the finish line. And I think having that type of balance in any founding team is really helpful for any kind of idea, figuring out, it is a balance. You need to be able to focus all of your resources towards specific goals when needed, but also, it's very limiting. Again, if you don't talk to anyone else and you don't meet other founders, as we were saying, like you need to be able to share learnings. You need to see how fast other people are sprinting to see if you need to sprint faster. It's all a balance, I guess. Yeah.
We've talked about, I think in the past, I believe with Benedict, the concept of surface area of luck, where, you can work really, really hard, but I think everyone on this earth will acknowledge that luck is a part of any success, even if it's a small part. And luck is not static, and you can actually expand your surface area of luck by doing the types of things that you were saying, Xian, to some extent, right? Getting out there, meeting people. You never know the connections you might make or the ideas that might crop up. But yes, it is a balancing act. If you only do that, you're never going to ship anything.
Yeah. My mother always says it's better to be lucky than smart.
Yeah. I like that one.
She has a lot of good quips. But to the extent that you can increase that surface area, I think that's a huge one.
Definitely.
I mean, what I tell my kids is just be nice. Being nice goes a long way with people, and like don't be a dick. And I think that's like a useful thing to just like be helpful, be nice, and then you kind of, not in a transactional way, right? But it's sort of, if you believe in karma at all, it comes back to help you.
Yeah, absolutely. Xi, this has been an incredible conversation. We're almost at the end, and we have one final question to ask you, and that is, who has been the most impactful person in your career to date, and why?
Oh gosh, probably my mom. I think for context, my mom is an investor, and when I was a kid, I just did not want to do anything like my mom. Right? You need to rebel. You need to run opposite direction. And so I did all this like policy stuff. I thought I was gonna like go work in like the government, all this and I think the older I get, the more I realize like all the things that my mom has taught me. And there's a lot around like, hey, if you really want to go do something, like don't be a dilettante, like study it deeply. Right. And you are capable of doing that. You just have to like put in the cycles to do it. I think there's a lot around like relationships and like, serendipity and like, meeting people, being open to like new ideas and new experiences, I think. And then, Yeah, and then I think she's like a very straightforward person. So like she worked a lot when I was a kid, and I was like, how come you never like drive me to swim practice, or like, my best friend's mom used to drive me to swim practice from school. And my mom's like, do you think it would make you swim faster? I was like, I don't know, maybe. And she's not gonna have an impact, right? It's not a good use of time. And she's like, frankly, it's pretty boring to watch kids swim up and down a pool. I was like, oh yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And so yeah, I think like there's an aspect of just like she's like unabashedly herself. She's like a fairly straightforward person. And then she went and built a firm that she started when she was 50, right?
Wow.
Which is not something that you normally think about. And in an era where there were like, our current era does not have that many female GPs. So her era had even fewer.
Mhm.
And she's just kind of like, I'm going to bet on myself. And I'm like, yeah, like that's a really important thing to like have the confidence to do, right? Which is like, how do you like have that faith in yourself, but how do you build up structures around yourself to go do that? So yeah, probably my mom.
I love that. She sounds like a freaking powerhouse. Huge cheers to her.
Cheers.
Thank you so much, Sheehan, for sharing your time and your resources and everything. We really, really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, guys. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks so much, Xian. I'm going to wrap up. This has been Beers with VCs episode 14 with Xian Ko. Have a great weekend. See you next time.